Muhammadu Buhari dies in London, assessing his legacy and lessons for Africa. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we speak truth to power and unpack the stories shaping our continent. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we reflect on the life, legacy, and lessons of Muhammadu Buhari, former Nigerian president and military ruler, who passed away in London at age 82. What does his story teach us about leadership, accountability, and Africa's future? Let's find out. On Sunday, July 13th, 2025, the family of former Nigerian president and military ruler Muhammadu Buhari announced his death at the age of 82 in a London clinic, where he had been receiving medical care for several weeks. His spokesperson, Garba Shehu, confirmed the news on X, formerly Twitter, asking for prayers for the deceased and referring to him as GCFR, his highest Nigerian national honor, Premium Times, 2025. Buhari's passing not only closes the chapter of a significant figure in Nigeria's military and democratic history, but also reignites debates across Africa about leadership, governance, health accountability, and the contradictions of post-colonial state building. This video critically examines Buhari's legacy within Nigeria and beyond, drawing lessons from his controversial tenure, comparing him to peers across the continent, and offering a forward-looking view on what his life and death mean for African governance. Buhari, soldier, statesman, symbol. Born in 1942 in Dara, Katsina State, Buhari grew up modestly, lost his father at an early age, and joined the Nigerian military in 1961. His career in the armed forces was marked by prominent roles in Nigeria's internal security, oil industry, and governance, culminating in his ascendancy to military head of state via a coup in December 1983, BBC 2023. In that brief military regime, 1984 to 85, Buhari sought to instill discipline and combat corruption, but was ousted by another faction for being perceived as autocratic and rigid. His second act came decades later, as a democratically elected president in 2015, a rare example of a former military ruler transitioning to an elected civilian leader in Africa. Guardian, 2025. Between 2015 and 2023, Buhari's presidency was defined by three major priorities: fighting Boko Haram and banditry in the north, tackling corruption in the public sector, investing in infrastructure like roads, railways, and power. Al Jazeera, 2023. However, critics point to rising insecurity, a floundering economy, worsening poverty, and accusations of human rights abuses as stains on his democratic record. Human Rights Watch, 2022. Critical analysis, strengths and failures. Strengths: integrity and anti-corruption stance. Buhari's personal reputation for frugality and incorruptibility, rare in Nigeria's political elite, inspired confidence at home and abroad. Infrastructure push. Projects like the Lagos-Ibadan Railway, Second Niger Bridge, and others demonstrated a commitment to physical development. African Development Bank, 2023. Repositioning Nigeria in Africa. Buhari's tenure saw Nigeria play more active roles in ECOWAS, the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, and climate negotiations. Weaknesses: health and absenteeism. Buhari spent significant portions of his presidency in London for medical treatment, exposing the lack of transparency and reliance on foreign healthcare by African leaders. Daily Trust, 2023. Insecurity and economic hardship. Insecurity deepened despite military campaigns, inflation surged, the naira collapsed, and millions fell into poverty. World Bank, 2024. Authoritarian tendencies, clampdowns on protests like NSARS, and media restrictions during his rule drew criticism from civil society. Amnesty International, 2021. Africa-wide comparison. Buhari's trajectory, soldier turned statesman, anti-corruption reformer turned embattled leader, mirrors a broader African pattern. Similar examples include Jerry Rawlings, Ghana, charismatic military ruler who became an elected president and oversaw democratic consolidation. Paul Kagame, Rwanda, military hero turned president, credited with development but accused of authoritarianism. Yoweri Museveni, Uganda, former rebel leader turned president, still clinging to power decades later. Compared to Rawlings, Buhari's economic outcomes were weaker and his democratic reforms less robust. Unlike Kagame or Museveni, Buhari respected term limits and stepped down in 2023, which remains a rare but commendable feat in Africa. However, Buhari, like many of his peers, failed to address the over-reliance of African elites on foreign healthcare, the fragility of national economies, and the disconnect between government and citizens. Forward-looking reflections. Buhari's death raises critical questions for Nigeria and Africa. Leadership succession. Buhari peacefully handed over power in 2023 to his elected successor, Bola Tinubu, showing institutional progress. Will Nigeria sustain this precedent amid growing polarization? Health accountability. His repeated trips abroad underline the urgency of investing in domestic healthcare systems accessible to all. Legacy of reform. Can future leaders build on his infrastructure investments and anti-corruption agenda while correcting his failings on human rights and inclusiveness? Continental influence. As the largest African economy and democracy, Nigeria's trajectory post-Buhari will significantly influence ECOWAS and AFCFTA implementation. African citizens and policymakers must demand more accountability and vision from their leaders, ones who do not just resist personal corruption, but also build resilient institutions, invest in people, and close the gap between promises and reality. Latest reactions and regional impact. Following the announcement of Buhari's death, condolences poured in from across the continent. Ghana's president described him as a disciplined soldier who became a Democrat. The African Union chairperson noted, Buhari embodied the struggle of post-colonial Africa, a desire for dignity tempered by the flaws of human imperfection. Markets in Nigeria and across West Africa remained steady, as Buhari was already out of office and no immediate political instability is expected. However, his passing may reignite scrutiny of Nigerian politics, military-civilian relations, and the health of African leaders who often govern from abroad. The debate over the so-called London syndrome, the phenomenon of African elites seeking healthcare, education, and even exile in former colonial capitals, is likely to intensify as Nigerians reflect on the symbolism of Buhari dying in London rather than in Abuja. Buhari's death reverberated across Africa, where his persona, austere, disciplined, and controversial, left an indelible mark on regional politics. African leaders react. Ghana, former President Nana Akufo-Addo, in his message, described Buhari as a principled African statesman who always put Nigeria first, even when the decisions were hard. South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa noted Buhari's contributions to African unity, recalling his leadership in ECOWAS' response to the Gambian and Malian crises. ECOWAS, the regional bloc, issued a statement mourning one of West Africa's elder statesmen who championed the sovereignty and stability of the sub-region. African Union, AU, Musa Faki Mahamat, AU Commission chairperson, praised Buhari's quiet but firm diplomacy in African affairs. Even beyond the continent, UK Prime Minister and UN Secretary General issued condolences, reflecting Buhari's stature as a senior African voice on security, counterterrorism, and climate change. Citizens react. While leaders' statements were respectful, popular reactions were mixed. Social media platforms saw tributes to his integrity and simplicity, criticisms of his silence on many national issues during his presidency, frustration at his reliance on London hospitals, which many Nigerians saw as emblematic of elite hypocrisy. These responses underscore the duality of Buhari's legacy, admired and resented in equal measure, a trait common to many post-independence African leaders. Long-term economic impact of Buhari's presidency, the numbers. By the end of Buhari's administration in 2023, GDP growth averaged 1.9%, below population growth, implying rising poverty. World Bank, 2024. Inflation hovered around 22%, severely weakening household purchasing power. The naira lost significant value against the dollar, further eroding incomes. Infrastructure investments created jobs and improved connectivity, but left Nigeria heavily indebted. While Buhari invested in tangible assets, critics argue he did little to reform structural weaknesses, over-reliance on oil, low tax revenue, and anemic industrial base. Africa-wide lessons. Buhari's experience reflects a broader African dilemma. Leaderships that prioritize infrastructure and anti-corruption rhetorically, but fail to translate them into broad-based prosperity. Countries like Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi and Kenya under Kibaki balanced infrastructure and economic reforms more effectively, suggesting that anti-corruption campaigns need to be coupled with transparent fiscal management and citizen-centered growth strategies. The London Syndrome and the healthcare paradox. Buhari's death abroad reignites the debate about African leaders' preference for foreign medical treatment. Nigeria, like many African nations, suffers from underfunded healthcare systems. According to WHO 2024, Nigeria's per capita health spending is under $100, compared to South Africa's $400 or Ghana's $200. This contradiction, leaders pledging to improve local health care while flying abroad for their own treatment, undermines public trust and drains scarce resources. Similar controversies have surrounded Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, who also died in a Singapore hospital, Gabon's Ali Bongo, who recuperated in Morocco after a stroke, Angola's José Eduardo dos Santos, who died in Spain. A forward-looking approach demands that African governments invest in world-class local facilities, both for their citizens and themselves, breaking this colonial-era dependency. The democratic question, staying within term limits. To Buhari's credit, he respected Nigeria's constitutional two-term limit and stepped down peacefully, a rarity in Africa where leaders often cling to power through constitutional amendments, electoral fraud, or force. By leaving office in 2023, Buhari joined a small club of African leaders, such as Ghana's John Mahama, Tanzania's Jakaya Kikwete, and Senegal's Abdoulaye Wade, who demonstrated that leadership is a relay, not a life sentence. In contrast, leaders like Yoweri Museveni, Uganda, Paul Biya, Cameroon, and Isaias Afwerki, Eritrea, have entrenched themselves for decades, often at the expense of democratic development. Policy implications for Nigeria and Africa. As Africa reflects on Buhari's life and death, several policy imperatives emerge. 1. Build local capacity, invest in public health, education, and infrastructure to reduce elite dependence on foreign services. 2. Strengthen institutions. Go beyond individual anti-corruption campaigns to build robust, transparent institutions. 3. Respect term limits. Enshrine peaceful transitions of power as a norm. 4. Inclusive growth. Prioritize economic policies that lift the majority out of poverty, not just headline infrastructure projects. 5th, regional leadership. Leverage Africa's big economies, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, to strengthen continental trade, security, and development. What comes next? As Nigeria under President Bola Tinubu navigates its path forward, Buhari's memory will cast a long shadow. His legacy, both inspiring and cautionary, provides a template of what to emulate and what to avoid. Africa's largest democracy cannot afford complacency. Deepening inequality, security threats, and climate vulnerabilities demand bold, innovative, and inclusive leadership. Buhari's journey, from a dusty village in Katsina to Nigeria's highest office, and finally to a London hospital bed, mirrors the contradictions of African governance, ambition and sacrifice intertwined with fragility and dependency. Buhari's influence on West African security and ECOWAS stability. During his years as a military leader and later as a civilian president, Muhammadu Buhari became a pivotal figure in the political and security architecture of West Africa, particularly within the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. While his domestic legacy remains contested, Buhari's contributions to regional diplomacy and security operations are a significant and often underappreciated part of his story. Nigeria's role in ECOWAS under Buhari. As Africa's most populous country and largest economy, Nigeria has traditionally been a cornerstone of ECOWAS. Buhari continued this tradition, using Nigeria's military, diplomatic clout, and financial muscle to maintain regional stability. Some of the most notable examples during his tenure include 1. The Gambia, 2016 to 2017. When outgoing Gambian President Yahya Jammeh refused to concede defeat after losing the 2016 elections to Adama Barrow, ECOWAS, under Buhari's leadership as a regional elder, intervened decisively. Buhari was appointed ECOWAS mediator in the Gambia, tasked with convincing Jammeh to step down peacefully. Nigerian troops formed the backbone of the ECOWAS mission in the Gambia, which entered Banjul and restored democratic order.
Buhari's quiet diplomacy and Nigeria's military readiness avoided a prolonged conflict, setting an example of regional responsibility. 2. Mali, 2020 to 2022. Mali underwent 2 military coups during Buhari's second term. ECOWAS, with Nigeria as an influential member, imposed sanctions and led mediation efforts to push for a transition back to civilian rule. Though results were mixed, Buhari consistently called for respecting constitutional order and emphasized ECOWAS' role in preventing a contagion of coups across the Sahel. 3. Combating Boko Haram and terrorism. While primarily a Nigerian problem, the Boko Haram insurgency has spilled over into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Buhari championed the Multinational Joint Task Force, MNJTF, bringing these countries together to fight the insurgents. His administration funded and coordinated regional military campaigns, though with limited long-term success as the conflict morphed into wider banditry and terrorism. Critical analysis, strengths and weaknesses. Strengths: commitment to democratic norms. Buhari used his stature to promote democratic transitions, as in the Gambia, strengthening ECOWAS' credibility as a regional watchdog. Willingness to deploy resources. Nigeria continued to shoulder financial and military burdens in ECOWAS peacekeeping missions, maintaining Nigeria's influence. Sahel engagement. Buhari recognized the transnational nature of insecurity in the Sahel and advocated multilateral solutions. Weaknesses. Limited strategic vision. Critics argue Nigeria, under Buhari, was reactive rather than proactive, often addressing crises only after they escalated. Domestic insecurity. Undermined leadership. Nigeria's inability to fully defeat Boko Haram or stop escalating banditry at home weakened its moral authority to lead others. Neglect of civilian-led solutions. Emphasis remained on military intervention, with less focus on governance, poverty alleviation, and inclusion as long-term solutions to insecurity.
Africa-wide comparisons. Buhari's regional interventions resemble those of other African leaders who have used their country's power to influence neighbors, South Africa under Thabo Mbeki and Cyril Ramaphosa, mediated in Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and the DRC. Kenya under Uhuru Kenyatta, brokered South Sudan's fragile peace deal. Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi, played a key role in Somalia's stabilization, though controversially. Unlike some of these examples, Buhari mostly respected multilateral institutions like ECOWAS and the African Union, rather than acting unilaterally, a strength in fostering legitimacy, but sometimes limiting swift action. Forward-looking reflections for Nigeria and ECOWAS. As Buhari exits the stage permanently, both Nigeria and ECOWAS face a daunting security and governance landscape. Rising coups, military takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Guinea in recent years threaten ECOWAS's credibility. Climate-driven conflict, desertification, and resource scarcity are intensifying competition and violence across the Sahel. Declining influence, China, Russia, and Turkey are increasingly filling security and economic roles in West Africa, challenging Nigeria's traditional leadership. Buhari's legacy offers lessons for future Nigerian and ECOWAS leaders. Uphold democratic norms even when inconvenient. Invest in long-term development and governance solutions, not just military force. Reimagine Nigeria's leadership as both a regional stabilizer and an innovator. How Buhari's anti-corruption agenda changed Nigerian politics. When Muhammadu Buhari won the Nigerian presidency in 2015, his central campaign promise and the foundation of his political brand was to fight corruption. To many Nigerians, weary after 16 years of the People's Democratic Party, PDP, Buhari seemed uniquely qualified. A retired general with a reputation for personal austerity and moral uprightness. Yet, as Buhari leaves the stage, Nigerians and Africans alike are asking, did he deliver on his anti-corruption promise? And what lessons does his experience hold for combating corruption in Africa's largest democracy and beyond? Buhari's anti-corruption strategy. The vision Buhari framed corruption not merely as theft, but as a systemic disease that sapped Nigeria's development and security. His administration pledged to recover stolen public assets, prosecute high-profile offenders, strengthen anti-corruption agencies like the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, and the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offenses Commission, ICPC, increase transparency in budgeting and public procurement. Major initiatives. 1. Asset recovery. Billions of naira and millions of dollars in stolen funds were reportedly recovered from former public officials. High-profile cases included former Petroleum Minister Diezani Alison Madueke and several governors. 2. Treasury Single Account, TSA, consolidated government revenues into a single account to limit leakages and ghost accounts. 3. Whistleblower policy, introduced monetary rewards for citizens who provided actionable information on corruption, leading to notable recoveries. 4. International cooperation, engaged with the US, UK, and UAE to track stolen Nigerian funds and prosecute fugitives abroad. Critical analysis, achievements and shortcomings. Achievements, symbolism, matters. Buhari's personal lifestyle, modest, devoid of ostentation, contrasted with Nigeria's notoriously lavish political culture, and set a tone, at least initially. Institutional empowerment. The EFCC became more visible and active during his tenure, prosecuting hundreds of cases and recovering assets. Innovative tools. The TSA and whistleblower policy became templates other African nations observed and in some cases emulated. Shortcomings. Selective justice. Critics accused Buhari's government of targeting opposition figures disproportionately while shielding allies, an accusation that weakened public trust. Transparency International, 2023. Weak prosecution. Many high-profile prosecutions dragged on for years without convictions, undermining deterrence. Systemic failure, petty corruption, contract padding, and bureaucratic rent-seeking persisted. Nigeria's rank on the Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, remained poor, 154th out of 180 in 2023. Africa-wide comparisons. Buhari's experience fits into a broader African struggle. Leaders elected on anti-corruption tickets often find themselves overwhelmed by entrenched patronage networks and institutional weaknesses. Examples: John Magufuli, Tanzania. Famed for his bulldozer approach to waste and corruption, Magufuli implemented swift reforms, but faced criticism for authoritarian tendencies. Paul Kagame, Rwanda. Maintained tight control over state finances, but at the expense of political freedoms. Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenya. Launched multiple anti-graft campaigns that faltered amid entrenched interests. In comparison, Buhari's approach was relatively moderate, more institutional than populist, but also more vulnerable to elite resistance. Forward-looking lessons. For Nigeria and Africa at large, Buhari's anti-corruption agenda underscores several lessons. Institutional independence. Anti-graft agencies must operate free from political interference to avoid charges of selective justice. Speed and finality. Justice delayed emboldens corruption. Swift, credible trials are essential. Beyond punishment, prevention, through transparent procurement, digital governance, and civic education, is as vital as prosecution. Citizen engagement. Nigerians initially supported Buhari's campaign, but grew disillusioned. Sustained anti-corruption requires participatory governance. Nigeria's next generation of leaders must build on Buhari's modest successes while correcting his failures, making anti-corruption a collective national ethos rather than a personal crusade. Lessons from Buhari for Africa's youth beyond hero worship. This final section will explore how Buhari's life, with its triumphs and contradictions, can inspire African youth to demand better leadership and become better leaders themselves. With the passing of Muhammadu Buhari at age 82 in a London hospital, Africa's largest democracy bids farewell to a figure whose life embodied the contradictions of African post-colonial leadership. Soldier and democrat, disciplinarian and absentee, reformer and protector of the status quo. For Africa's youth, who make up over 60% of the continent's population, Buhari's story offers more than a historical footnote. It provides a complex, instructive case study on leadership, accountability, and civic responsibility in a region still struggling to translate its demographic energy into governance transformation. Buhari as a symbol. What youth admired. Many young Africans admired Buhari, especially in the early days of his 2015 campaign, for his personal frugality and disdain for ostentation in an era of flashy politics, his promise to tackle corruption and reclaim national pride, his respect for constitutional limits, stepping down after 2 terms, his embodiment of the idea that change was possible even after decades of entrenched PDP rule. In a continent where many leaders cling to power beyond constitutional limits, e.g., Biya in Cameroon, Museveni in Uganda, Buhari's peaceful handover of power in 2023 stands as a rare, positive example for young Africans yearning for democratic norms. Buhari's contradictions. What youth must learn from. At the same time, his tenure also illustrated the perils of hero worship and over-reliance on individuals rather than systems. His aloof and sometimes detached leadership alienated many supporters. His health problems and prolonged absences in London underscored the dangers of electing leaders without transparency on their fitness to govern. His failure to tackle rising insecurity and deepen inclusive economic growth highlighted the limits of personal integrity when institutions remain weak. his perceived tolerance of impunity among allies eroded trust in his anti-corruption crusade. These contradictions remind young Africans that even the most principled leaders can falter if citizens fail to hold them accountable and if institutions remain fragile. Beyond Buhari, youth as architects of Africa's future. Key lessons for Africa's youth demand transparency. Leaders must disclose their health, assets, and decisions. Youth should insist on these standards before and after elections. Build institutions, not just individuals. A strong democracy depends on independent courts, legislatures, media, and civil society, not a single savior figure. Engage beyond elections. Civic engagement, protests, volunteering, advocacy must continue between elections to keep governments accountable. Prepare to lead. The next generation must equip itself with education, integrity, and vision to contest and win leadership roles rather than just critique from the sidelines. Africa-wide youth movements, momentum to harness. Across Africa, youth movements are already rising. NSARS in Nigeria, 2020. Youth-led protests demanding police reform. Yanamare in Senegal, 2012. A collective that helped stop constitutional manipulation. Fees must fall in South Africa, 2015 to 16. Students challenging education inequality. Lucha in DRC. A youth-led movement advocating for good governance. These examples show that when youth organize constructively, they can reshape political landscapes, something Buhari himself acknowledged in his later years. Forward-looking vision. Buhari's death is not just the closing of a chapter. It is a challenge to African youth to write the next chapter, one where governance is not about hero worship, but about shared responsibility. Instead of waiting for another Buhari, Africa's young people must demand and become the leaders they seek, ensuring the continent's future is shaped by courage, competence, and compassion. Closing thought. Buhari's journey, from a dusty village in Dara to Nigeria's State House, and finally to a quiet death in London, is a story of resilience, ambition, and imperfection. For Africa's youth, his life is a reminder that leadership is neither sainthood nor villainy, but a test of character, vision, and humility. It is now up to the next generation to carry that test forward. Advice to African leaders. 1. Lead by example. Buhari's reputation for personal austerity, simplicity, and resistance to ostentation helped him win public trust, especially early in his presidency. Leaders who embody the values they preach inspire confidence and legitimacy. Advice. Cultivate personal integrity not as theater, but as a lifestyle, and ensure it translates into institutional ethics. 2. Be present and transparent. Prolonged medical absences abroad and lack of communication eroded Buhari's authority. African citizens deserve leaders who are physically, mentally, and emotionally present and honest about their capacities. Advice. Be transparent about your health, decision-making, and whereabouts. Strengthen systems so governance doesn't collapse when you are absent. 3. Respect the Constitution. Buhari's peaceful handover of power after 2 terms set him apart from many of his peers who cling to office at all costs. Advice. Protect term limits and strengthen institutions to outlive personal ambition. Leadership is a relay race. Hand over the baton gracefully. Invest at home. Buhari's dependence on London healthcare, while leaving Nigerian hospitals underfunded, symbolized a broader African elite dependency on former colonial centers. Advice. Prioritize investments in health, education, and infrastructure that benefit all citizens, including yourselves. Leadership demands faith in your own people and institutions. 5. Empower youth and institutions. Buhari's initial popularity with young people waned because his administration didn't sufficiently open up opportunities or empower them. Without strong institutions and engaged youth, reforms collapse. Advice. Create platforms for youth participation, nurture civic engagement, and build resilient institutions instead of relying on individual charisma. Summary of key messages. This series on Muhammadu Buhari's legacy has explored his complex life and what it teaches Africa. Leadership as service, not privilege. Buhari's personal example of simplicity and respect for term limits shows leadership is stewardship, not ownership. Integrity is necessary, but not sufficient. Personal ethics matter, but without strong institutions and inclusive policies, reforms falter. Youth are the future and the present. Young Africans must move beyond hero worship and engage critically, demanding accountability and preparing to lead. Regional leadership is critical. Nigeria under Buhari played a pivotal role in ECOWAS and West African stability, a role every African power must embrace constructively. Independence on foreign systems, the London syndrome, reliance on foreign healthcare and education reflects poorly on African governments. Leaders must build confidence in homegrown systems. In memory of Muhammadu Buhari, 1942 to 2025, may his story inspire a more accountable, equitable, and self-reliant Africa. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, your space for critical African analysis and fearless conversation. If you found this insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. Together, let's shape a better future for Africa. Until next time, stay bold.